a physicist and human systems ecologist, and for over a decade I've been working on large-scale risk, and that's involved everything from the socioeconomic implications of pandemics to financial system collapses to societal vulnerability, peak oil, all of these things, but all gathered around large-scale societal risk and increasingly working on societal preparedness and response to those risks.
What do people need to know, David?
In the broad sense, I think our predicament is that we face an increasing array of stresses and shocks, both environmental and socioeconomic, and they are interacting through increasingly vulnerable societal systems. So societal systems are everything: supply chains, infrastructures, the coordination of human behavior, these sort of things. So that's our predicament. And what that means for us is that I think we're increasingly moving into an age of destabilization, where those stresses through those more vulnerable societal systems interact, and they more and more destabilize our economies, our abilities to work together socially, to the operations of infrastructures, etc., etc. So this world is a more volatile world, a more surprising world, because you think of it, you know, societies are hit by one thing and then they're hit by another. So we're seeing that evolving as the pandemic goes through society. It's economic, it's food security, and it's social consequences. So I think this is our future world. So more vulnerable, more surprises, and we have to be, in a sense, alive to that. So,
could you give like some examples of what you're trying to describe? Like current day example. We're in April 23rd, 2020.
Okay. Well, the most obvious one is there is a health crisis that has spread around the world pretty rapidly through aviation and the complex transport networks that we live through and rely upon. That has kicked off within countries a health crisis. The crisis itself and our society's response in terms of lockdown has started to shut down societies. So we're seeing a propagation and a fall in demand. So people aren't buying, people aren't, factories and businesses aren't opening because there's either not people working, and there's a supply chain contagion. So things are being interrupted. And a good example of that is the food system. There are, all the way through it, there are farms that can't get workers to pick the fruit that is coming onto their trees. We're having difficulties in the processing. So we know companies across the world have had their production disrupted in terms of meat packers and in the United States. And we're also seeing that going all the way through to supply chains into supermarkets. And of course, this sort of shock through the food system is also reflected in the fact that we had a very synchronized system, a very stable system, but it was adapted to both feed supermarkets and to feed restaurants and catering. And of course, one of the things that happened because out of the lockdown and out of that cluster of events is that those businesses have stopped, but the supply chain hasn't been able to adapt easily. So we have these shocks rippling out from that's economic, that's through food systems, and of course we're seeing it through the financial system, because if businesses aren't operating, and if the future is uncertain, and particularly if we're starting to expect multiple pandemic waves, businesses have a question over their viability, which means bank loans have a question over whether they can be serviced. And in the good times, we know that corporations have taken on a huge amount of debt, and they're being hit left, right, and centre. So we have this propagation of shocks in multiple directions. But of course, the thing is, the shocks don't just go out and interact, they're also coming back, and they will over the years ahead. So we know, for example, in a very tragic way, that many middle income and poor countries now have a food crisis. But if they've, some countries like Algeria get a lot of their income from exporting oil. Of course, oil prices have crashed. So their income into the country has fallen. And for many of these countries also, they depend a lot on remittances. And the remittances are also often sent from wealthier countries to poor countries. And the people sending the remittances, by and large, are people who work in the service economy, the lower income part. So we have this convergence of multiple crises, food crises within the country, just because there's a breakdown in the flow of goods, also people's capacity to earn. If you're in many countries in Africa or India, you're part of the informal economy, you're just getting by day to day. So, you've lost your income. Many of these people don't have savings because they're just about surviving and supporting their families. It works when the system integrates. They might be poor, but once the system is working, now it's fragmented, their income is dropping, their country income is dropping because they're not selling as many exports. And this is really a profound challenge. So we see from the World Food and Agricultural Organization that they're putting out serious warnings of major global famines. And this was really to be expected, unfortunately. I wrote about this in February, that this pandemic will bring along a global food crisis. But that, of course, means in future, well, we know food crises are a pretty good indicator, if there are already stresses in a political system, of large-scale social unrest. So we can expect more of that in whatever form, and that, of course, has a blowback to other places elsewhere, to neighbouring countries. And as we saw, the poor people who were leaving Syria as refugees, trying to come to Europe, all of the social crises, some of it manufactured, but that brought. So we have this interaction and compounding of events. And of course, these things will be happening when countries are dealing with probably growing sense of financial crises, going into depression. So it's really this convergence of lots of things. And there are more surprises. So what we talk about this normally, we'd say these are like very fat-tailed distributions. And that just means that there's a huge scope for interactions. And we don't know where they are, but we know that, if you're hit by two things at once, it's generally harder than being hit by one thing and hit by the other thing at another time, because, your coping capacity falls. And that's true at the personal level. It's true at a nation's level. So we gave the examples of those countries, middle and poor countries, dealing with lots of things. And it's also true at the international level. So if you were one of those countries looking for food, or if you're an indebted country looking for IMF support, at the moment, because we've a synchronized global crises, everybody's will be looking for support of some sort, but the capacity to give support will be much less per those asking. Actually, it may even decline, because the countries that would normally give extra funding in a time of crisis are themselves stressed and are less likely to. So this sort of compounding of events is very much this feature of the world, of multiple things happening at the same time, of one thing after another that you barely stand up and then you're hit by something again. So this is a feature not just of this crisis, but it can be said this is a feature of a destabilizing world. And we can see another example, the fires in California and Australia. It seems an age ago because of what's been happening since. But again, that's an example that, there are fires in California, and then, of course, they have to start cutting the grid. So you're compounding that. Now, of course, you think about what does that mean for your ability to adapt? Well, if fires become the new norm, people are more likely to move out of those regions that are vulnerable. But the company that runs the grid says we need to invest to be more resilient to the fires in this region in future. But if people are moving out or selling their homes because this is a vulnerable area, well, then the outlook for the grid company to invest in that resilience becomes harder because its future income looks less. So that makes it even more vulnerable. So it's this combination of effects and interactions that I think is a defining part of our age, and that's where we really need to start to have a serious think of not even so much how do we solve problems, but either how do we adapt or how do we prepare, because these crises are no longer on the horizon, as we're seeing now today. They're very much coming into view. And as we go through this crisis, I don't know what's going to happen next year. I can tell you we'll be a lot more battered than we were last year. We'll be more vulnerable. And what happens if there's major hurricanes? There's a major hurricane season. It hits critical areas of the United States. There will still probably be a pandemic. What do you do if you've got to evacuate people in a time of a pandemic? How does that both endanger more people? How does it stress emergency services, et cetera, et cetera? So again, across scales from the personal to the global, this is a feature of our world. But, we work from where we're at, So the question then is really, what can I do, or what can we do as a community, or we do as a city, or we do as a country, or we do as a globe? Where are the opportunities to be more prepared, and how do we make better rather than worse decisions?
If you appreciate hearing from David and having me have him on the line, then please subscribe and hit the bell so you get notifications, because I'll try to continue bringing stuff like this to you. Put a comment in, hit the like, and that's a way to stroke my ego a little bit so I keep doing what I'm doing.